I'm Lindsay Mitchell, 28 years old, and last month I watched my beloved grandfather Harold take his final breath. He raised me when no one else would, leaving me his cherished home and his will. 2 days after his funeral, I returned to find the locks changed and my mother Brenda inside. When I showed her the will, she laughed in my face. "You have nothing here," she sneered, slamming the door. I stood there homeless, shaking with rage and grief. Before continue the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and stick around to see how I took back what was rightfully mine from the woman who abandoned me twice. My relationship with my grandfather Harold was the closest thing to a parent-child bond I'd ever experienced. When I was 8, my parents went through a bitter divorce that shattered our family. My father moved across the country for work, while my mother Brenda seemed to view her newfound freedom as an opportunity to reinvent herself without the burden of a child. Within months, she met Frank, a charismatic businessman who didn't particularly like children. One evening, after yet another argument about her increasing absences, she packed a suitcase and dropped me off at my grandfather's modest 2-bedroom house in the suburbs of Portland. Just for a few weeks, she promised, kissing my forehead. Those weeks turned into months and eventually years. Grandpa Harold never complained once. He was a retired high school English teacher with a passion for woodworking and gardening. His home became my sanctuary. The backyard maple tree held a swing he built by hand. My bedroom walls, once bare, gradually filled with photographs, achievement certificates, and memories. "Family isn't always bloodlines," he would say, helping me with homework at the kitchen table. "Family is who shows up, who stays, who puts in the work." Throughout high school and college, I watched my mother's sporadic appearances decrease further. She'd send birthday cards with cash, occasionally call during holidays. But the woman who gave birth to me had effectively chosen a new life with Frank. They traveled extensively, started businesses together, and settled 3 hours away in Seattle. Meanwhile, Grandpa Harold attended every school play, drove me to soccer practice, and taught me to change a tire and balance a checkbook. When I graduated from college, he sat in the front row, tears streaming down his weathered face. I got a job at a marketing firm in Portland and rented a small apartment. It's downtown, but visited him every weekend. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years ago, there was no question about what would happen next. I moved back home to care for him. Those final months were precious and painful. We watched old westerns together. I read his favorite poetry aloud, and we had conversations that stretched late into the night. During one such evening, as I adjusted his pillows, he brought up the house. "Lindsay, I want you to know that this place will be yours when I'm gone," he said, his voice weak but determined. "I've already arranged everything with Benjamin, my attorney. This house gave you stability once. Wanted to do that for you again." I tried to shush him, not wanting to discuss a future without him, but he insisted. "Your mother will likely make a fuss," he continued. "She's always felt entitled to things she didn't earn. But I've made my wishes clear. Legally, this home belongs to you." When he passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning, I was holding his hand. The grief was overwhelming, like drowning on dry land. I could barely function during the funeral arrangements, grateful that Grandpa had pre-planned most details. The reading of the will happened 1 week after the funeral. Benjamin Reynolds, Grandpa's longtime attorney and friend, confirmed what he had told me. The house, along with a modest life insurance policy and his personal possessions, were left to me. My mother sat across the room, her face tightening as Benjamin read the terms. "There must be some mistake," she interrupted. "I'm his only child." "There's no mistake, Mrs. Wallace," Benjamin replied calmly. Harold was very specific about his wishes. After the reading, my mother cornered me in the hallway, Frank hovering behind her like a shadow. "You manipulated him when he was sick and vulnerable," she hissed. "This isn't over." I was too exhausted by grief to engage. My friend Rachel suggested I stay with her for a few days to process everything before officially moving back into Grandpa's house. It seemed like a good idea to have some emotional support rather than facing those empty rooms alone. Immediately, "Are you sure your mom won't try anything?" Rachel asked, as we drove away from the attorney's office. "What could she do?" I replied. "The will is clear. Grandpa made his intentions known to everyone, including his attorney. How terribly naive I was. How unprepared for the lengths to which a bitter, entitled woman would go. I spent 3 days with Rachel, sorting through my feelings and making plans for the house. I thought about which rooms I might renovate, how I'd preserve Grandpa's garden, whether I should keep his workshop intact. These thoughts became a lifeline through grief, a future to move toward. I had no idea that across town my mother was already setting her plan in motion. On Friday morning, I drove to what was now legally my house, carrying coffee and fresh bagels. I planned to start cleaning out the refrigerator and sorting through some of Grandpa's clothes to donate. When I pulled into the driveway, something felt immediately wrong. The curtains in the living room had been changed from Grandpa's faded blue ones to cream-colored panels I'd never seen before. With growing unease, I walked up the familiar stone path and inserted my key into the front door.
Ow.
It didn't work. I tried again, jiggling the handle, but the key wouldn't turn. That's when I noticed the new deadbolt installed above the original lock. I knocked first politely, then more forcefully as panic rose in my chest. Finally, the door swung open, and there stood my mother, dressed as if for a business meeting. "Lindsay," she said flatly, "what are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I repeated, stunned. "This is my house. Grandpa left it to me. What are you doing here? And why are the locks changed?" She smiled thinly and stepped aside, revealing the interior. The living room had been partially emptied, with Grandpa's favorite recliner notably missing. Boxes were stacked against one wall. "Your grandfather and I had an understanding," she said smoothly. "This house has been in our family for generations. He always intended for it to stay with his daughter." Frank appeared behind her, placing a possessive hand on her shoulder. "We've already spoken with our attorney. Harold wasn't in his right mind when he made that will, with all the medications he was taking." I stood there speechless for a moment before finding my voice. "That's not true. He was completely lucid. He told me multiple times the house would go to me. It's in his will." I fumbled in my purse for the copy of the will Benjamin had given me, thrusting it toward them. My mother barely glanced at it. "Papers can be changed," she said dismissively. "What matters is what he told me personally. I'm his daughter. You're just his grandchild. I took care of him for 2 years while he was dying," I said, my voice cracking. "Where were you? In Europe? On another cruise? You barely called him." Frank stepped forward, his imposing frame filling the doorway. "I think you should leave now, Lindsay. This is a family matter that will be settled legally." "I am family," I shouted, tears stinging my eyes. "And this house is legally mine." "You have nothing here," my mother said coldly, moving to close the door. "We'll have our attorneys contact you." The door slammed in my face. I stood there in disbelief, the bag of now cold bagels still clutched in my hand. Through the window, I could see them continuing to pack up my grandfather's belongings, as if I weren't even there. I retreated to my car and immediately called Benjamin Reynolds. His secretary said he was in court, but promised he would call back as soon as possible. Next, I called Rachel, barely able to form coherent sentences through my tears. "They've taken over the house," I sobbed. "They changed the locks. They're packing up his things." Rachel immediately offered to come get me, but I needed answers first. I drove to the local police station, naively hoping they could help. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic, but explained that this was a civil matter, not criminal. "Even though I have the will showing I own the house?" I asked desperately. "Unfortunately, yes," he confirmed. "You'll need to go through the courts to enforce the will and evict them if they're unlawfully occupying your property by." The time Benjamin called me back, I was sitting in a coffee shop parking lot feeling homeless and betrayed. He was outraged when I explained what had happened. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he said firmly. "The will is crystal clear, and I can personally attest that your grandfather was of sound mind when he made his decisions. Your mother has no legal ground to stand on." "So what do?" I asked, feeling completely lost. "We'll need to file for an emergency eviction," he explained. "But I have to warn you, Lindsay, these things can take time. The courts are backed up, and your mother seems prepared to fight dirty." The weight of what was happening crashed down on me. Not only had I lost my grandfather, but now I was facing a legal battle with my own mother over the home where I grew up. The home that was rightfully mine. "How much will this cost?" I asked, suddenly realizing the financial implications. There was a slight pause. "Won't be." "Inexpensive," Benjamin admitted, But Harold was my friend for 40 years. I'll work with you on the payments. That night, I stayed at Rachel's apartment again, this time not by choice but necessity. As I lay on her pull-out couch, I scrolled through photos. On my phone, pictures of me and Grandpa in the garden he loved, standing proudly beside the bookshelves we built together, celebrating my college graduation on the front porch. Each image was a reminder of what had been stolen from me. "I can't believe she would do this," Rachel said, handing me a cup of tea. "I mean, I know your relationship was strained, but this is a whole new level." I always thought deep down she cared. "At least a little," I whispered. But now I realize she only cares about herself. She abandoned me once when I was a child, and now she's doing it again. I fell into an uneasy sleep that night, torn between crushing grief and building anger. Mother, who had walked out of my life when I needed her most, was now trying to take the only real home I'd ever known. The fight ahead seemed impossible, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not let her erase my grandfather's final wish. The next morning, I drove past the house on my way to work, a detour I couldn't help making. What I saw made my stomach drop. My mother and Frank were loading Grandpa's antique desk, the one where he wrote letters and graded papers for decades, into a rented moving truck. They were emptying the house of its valuables. Without thinking, I pulled into the driveway, blocking the truck. I jumped out of my car, shaking with fury. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded. "Those aren't your things to take." My mother barely looked up from her clipboard. "Lindsay, we've been through this. Go to work. This doesn't concern you." "That desk belonged to Grandpa's father," I said, my voice rising. "He specifically wanted me to have it. It's listed in the will." Frank stepped toward me menacingly. "Move your car now." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the police. This is theft." My mother's expression changed from dismissive to angry. "Go ahead, call them." To my shock, she pulled out her own phone and dialed before I could. "Yes. Hello. There's a woman trespassing on our property and threatening us. We need assistance immediately." She gave the address, then smiled coldly at me. "They're on their way." I stood frozen, unable to comprehend that she was calling the police on me, her own daughter, at the house that legally belonged to me. 20 minutes later, I was explaining my situation to two officers while fighting back tears of frustration. I showed them the will on my phone, but just like the officer at the station had said, they explained it was a civil matter. "Ma'am, we understand your frustration, but we can't determine property ownership on site," one officer explained gently. "If there's a dispute about the will and property ownership, that needs to be resolved in court." "But they're taking things that belong to me," I protested. "Without a court order specifying what items belong to whom, we can't stop them from moving property," the other officer said. The humiliation of standing in my own driveway, being treated like an intruder while my mother smugly watched, was almost unbearable. I had no choice but to move my car and leave. Watching in my rearview mirror as they continued loading my grandfather's precious belongings into the truck, at work I could barely focus. During my lunch break, I called Benjamin again to update him on what was happening. "They're emptying the house of valuables," I said, my voice breaking. "By the time we get to court, there will be nothing left." "This complicates things," Benjamin admitted, "but it also strengthens our case. They're clearly acting in bad faith. I've drafted the emergency eviction paperwork. But I've also learned your mother has retained Victor Sullivan as her attorney." My heart sank. Victor Sullivan was notorious in Portland legal circles and aggressive, borderline unethical lawyer who specialized in property disputes and wasn't above using dirty tactics. "What does that mean for us?" I asked. "Means they're preparing for a fight," Benjamin said grimly. "Sullivan will try to drag this out, challenge the will, possibly even claim your grandfather was unduly influenced by you during his illness. The suggestion that I had somehow manipulated my dying grandfather made me physically ill. That's disgusting. I was taking care of him. I know that, Lindsay. We'll make sure the court knows it too. But I need to prepare you, this could get ugly and expensive." After hanging up, I sat in my car and did something I'd been avoiding. I calculated my finances. Between my modest marketing salary, rent for my apartment, student loans, and now unexpected legal fees, I was looking at a financial disaster. Had some savings, but nowhere near enough for a prolonged legal battle. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I created a spreadsheet of all my expenses, trying to figure out where I could cut costs. I considered taking a second job, selling my car, anything to fund this fight. The injustice of it all kept hitting me in waves. Not only had I lost my grandfather and my home, but now I was going into debt trying to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The next day, Rachel connected me with her cousin, who worked in real estate law. She couldn't represent me, but over coffee, she offered some advice and resources. Document everything, she emphasized. Take photos of the house, make lists of what was inside, gather any witnesses who heard your grandfather express his wishes. Witnesses, I repeated, suddenly remembering something important. Grandpa's neighbors, the Hendersons. They've lived next door for 20 years. They were there when he told me the house would be mine. This small realization felt like the first positive development in days. I immediately drove to the Hendersons' house after work. Martha Henderson answered the door, her face lighting up when she saw me, then falling as she registered my expression. "Oh, Lindsay," she said, pulling me into a hug. "We've been so worried. We've seen your mother and that husband of hers coming and going." Arthur tried to talk to them yesterday and got quite a rude response. Inside their cozy living room, the Hendersons confirmed they would be willing to provide statements about my grandfather's intentions. They had heard him mention multiple times that the house would go to me. "He was so proud of you, dear," Martha said, squeezing my hand. "The way you cared for him those last months, I've never seen such devotion." This validation from people who had witnessed our relationship brought fresh tears to my eyes as I was leaving. Arthur mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "They've put up a for sale sign in the yard this morning," he said. "Seems they're not wasting any time." I drove around the block to confirm, and there it was, a real estate sign bearing the name of a high-end agency. My mother wasn't just trying to claim the house, she was planning to sell it out from under me. That night I made a difficult decision and posted about my situation on social media, careful to stick to the facts without venturing into potential defamation. I explained that my grandfather had left me his house, but my estranged mother had moved in, changed the locks, and was now attempting to sell the property against my grandfather's explicit wishes. The post quickly generated supportive comments, but also brought unexpected consequences. A distant cousin messaged me privately to say my mother had been telling family members that I had manipulated my grandfather while he was on heavy medications, convincing him to change his will to spite her. "No one who knows you believes it," my cousin assured me, "but she's really pushing this narrative." The realization that my mother was actively trying to damage my reputation within our extended family felt like another betrayal. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about the house. She seemed determined to punish me for having the relationship with Grandpa that she had never bothered to maintain. As I scrolled through local real estate listings that night, my heart stopped when I found it Grandpa's house. My house listed for $590,000. The listing included professional photos taken that very day, showcasing rooms that had been hastily staged with most of Grandpa's personal touches already removed. The description read, "Charming family home with great bones, ready for your personal touch. Motivated sellers. Priced to move quickly." They weren't just selling my inheritance, they were erasing any trace that my grandfather had ever lived there, and they were rushing to close a deal before I could stop them. The next day, during my lunch break, I drove by the house again. It's a painful ritual I couldn't seem to break. The for sale sign now had a virtual tour available rider attached. To it, I parked across the street, fighting the urge to march up to the door and demand entrance to my own home. Instead, I called the real estate agency listed on the sign, pretending to be an interested buyer. The agent was enthusiastic, explaining that the sellers were motivated and already reviewing offers. When I asked about the property history and ownership, she hesitated slightly before saying the house had been in the same family for years and was now being sold as part of an estate. Settlement, a partial truth that obscured the real story,